TransformTO. So take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby, and welcome everyone. I'll try to be as brief as I can because the meat of the presentation is coming after me. So I'm really just kind of setting the stage here and starting with the policy context. So on the next slide, when we are talking about what the City of Toronto is committed to, Council committed us to achieving net zero by 2040 for the whole City of Toronto, including city operations as well. And they established a separate interim reduction targets. The reason for that is to try to address climate emergency as best as possible. At the time, I'll just add that as the climate crisis effects became more apparent over time, our targets became more stringent. So we started with 80% reduction by 2050, then net zero by 2050. Now we are at net zero by 2040. And the latest UN report is asking actually most of the industrialized world to set up a 2040 net zero targets for the whole countries, not just for the individual cities. So for City of Toronto, what does it mean? On the next slide, you can see on the graph, is that essentially it's not business as usual. We did run a number of scenarios, what's needed to get to net zero. We realized that business as planned, like to achieve the 80% reduction by 2050, would not get us anywhere close to net zero by 2040. So we need to do much more than we planned to originally. And on the next slide, we can see that because of where the greenhouse gas emissions in Toronto are coming from, it's mostly from buildings and transportation. That's two major fields or sections of the society that we're going to be focusing on. And in this presentation, I guess, or my portion of the presentation will be focusing mostly on buildings, and then we can tie in with the EV later on. So on the next slide, we are just addressing the section on the buildings is by looking at the new construction. City of Toronto is trying to address that by Toronto Green Standard. And on next slide, we are doing this typically, we have been doing this from 2010, and design requirements are being established. We are now at version 4, starting from last year. And what's new thing for this year, for the current version, is that we added more stringent requirements, especially related to emission reduction, embodied carbon, as well as green infrastructure targets. So on the next slide, just briefly, there's really TGS comprised of 3 different sets of standards. Low-rise residential Part 9 type of buildings, and then the second most used part of the standard is for the Part 3 type of buildings. And then we have a separate standard for city-owned buildings, municipal-owned buildings, which tends to be more stringent. It's equivalent to Tier 2 of the Part 3 TGS standard, or more stringent than that. So on the next slide, while we will be focusing in our presentation mostly on the energy and emission side, as well as the EV ready requirements, just want to point out that TGS does try to encompass and look at the whole building and the building site. So it does cover the ecology side, water efficiency, and circular economy, in addition to the other 2. So on the next slide, on advancing the net zero, the goal is to advance it, to try to do it earlier, to act as a market transformation tool, to be in at least 1 step ahead than Ontario Building Code requirements, or actually think that we are a couple of steps ahead than Ontario Building Code. So on the next slide, you can see that we are doing this by establishing clear tiers, clear kind of steps and clear timeline when those steps must be achieved. So at version 3 in 2018, we had 4 tiers, and each new version of TGS takes out the bottom tier. And by the time we get to TGS version 6 in 2028, so 10 years since it was established, what used to be a tier 4 under version 3 becomes a mandatory near zero emission type of standard. We did the reference building comparison, and we can look at the kind of version TGS version 4 when you're comparing to the Ontario Building Code. The tier 1 requirements are about 30 to 40% depending on building archetype. Tier 2 is roughly 50% better than code, and tier 3 roughly 65% better than code. So on how we are managing, on the next slide, we are looking in both metrics on the energy side and the greenhouse gas side. On the energy side, we are trying to look at the energy intensity unit index as well as the thermal energy demand units. And you can see on the table that as the tiers are more progressive, those numbers are more stringent and lower numbers. So it gets a little bit more complicated. It gets a little bit harder to achieve them, but it's not outside of the realm of impossibility. And it's very clear where the requirements are. So, everybody who is building now knows that in 2028, what is listed now as tier 3, that's where what will be a mandatory requirement, and you can hopefully plan for it and design for it in time. Just want to point it out that in this pyramid as well, TUI and TEDI are really addressing the bottom 2 parts where we are aiming to reduce the energy loads through passive design, and then looking into improving the efficiency of mechanical systems, which now can be much smaller because you have reduced the energy loads through passive design. Also, those buildings tend to be more resilient to the extreme weather events, and in general more comfortable for the building tenants or users. So the next slide, the third one that we are looking into is the greenhouse gas emissions target, and that's the top of the pyramid. Really, we are looking into so the energy that you can use that you cannot generate on a site by yourself, like using renewables. Then aim is to connect to low carbon energy. And as you can see in the table as well, net zero emissions are already mandatory facility-owned facilities. So we decided, as the council decided, that to lead by example, we need to set a pace, and that we need to show that we are not just asking everybody to do it, but we are actually doing it ourselves and walking the talk. The next slide. The new thing that we added in TGS version 4 is we started looking into embodied carbon from building materials. And on the next slide, you can see there are reasons why, again, right at the moment, it's only for the tier 2 and 3. It's required for city buildings, but as tier 2 and 3 are voluntary, so it's voluntary for everybody else. Requires the life cycle assessment and looking into embodied carbon in the major building materials, typically structural and envelope materials. As I said, for the city buildings, it's mandatory to do this, and then there is optional target to try to reduce it 20% better than what's the baseline. On the next slide, you can see in meantime, over last year, with help from TAF, Toronto, and consultants that we hired, we looked into the embodied carbon emissions and the various typology of the buildings and what is currently used in real examples of the buildings that were recently built or designed in Toronto area, and with the goal of eventually putting potential caps on the embodied carbon, and essentially possibly doing it a similar step code, kind of same thing as for the TEDI TUI or GHGI. We may have something for embodied carbon similar to that. There will be a council report because council asked us to do this. So city planning will be going to the council probably in May, providing the report and with some recommendations attached to that. And I guess once it's public, then we'll know what it is, what's been decided or proposed to the council to look into establishing those targets. The next section I'm going to look into is, again, trying to say that what we are doing is that we are trying to walk the talk, and that the city is also trying to look into our own emissions and reduce them as much as possible. So on the next slide, as it just shows where on the city-owned corporation, all the city agencies, city-owned corporations, and as well our divisions, where the emissions are coming from. And you can see that the majority of emissions are coming from buildings and transportation. Obviously, TTC is a major part of that because of the diesel and buses that you're using. They have a plan that's already adopted to transition to e-buses. So that big green section is going to be reduced over time, very quickly over the next decade. On the other hand, majority of our heating, that's the red under the building section, it's coming from use of natural gas for the heating of space and water. So that's the section that we want to work on reducing it. And on the next slide, on the TransformTO, which is our strategy to get to net zero, there's a separate section of targets that are, we call them leading by example targets, where the council said by 2030, this is what city operations must do. And some of those targets I just highlighted just based on we have targets on transitioning the city fleet, both buses and the regular or other type of vehicles that we use. At least half of them need to be transitioned to zero emissions vehicles. So that kind of tie in very much into the EV requirements, EV charging requirements. But on both new construction starting last year, we had to start all the new city buildings to be designed to net zero. And starting this year, council requires us to all new equipment installed in existing buildings must also contribute to net zero. So on the next slide, I just want to, in the TGS version 4 for the city buildings, on the emission side, so again, this is TGS for the city buildings. So we have GHGI equals 0. That's a requirement. And on energy side, we have offered 4 different options to meet. The first one is pretty much meeting a tier 2 of the part 3 TGS. And the other 3 options are really there to help, because large majority of the city-owned buildings do not really fit into regular archetypes that are typically built in Toronto, but they're typically uniquely municipal type of buildings, which don't really exist there. So we don't really have an archetype. So we had to offer a little bit more flexibility on how to meet that. And you will see a little bit in some examples why that was offered. But we have some examples as well, so you can see on the slide, next slide, we do, even I put it in leadership by doing, we try to practice that, what we preach. So we already have 2 buildings that are in the construction. Mount Dennis Childcare Center, which will be our largest childcare center in Toronto, will be finished this year. Northeast Scarborough Community Center is under construction, will be completed by the end of next year. We just mentioned that both of these buildings were already certified to Canadian zero carbon building standard. That was also strategically as well. That was one of the first ones going through. We felt it will be good to have a third-party verification that what we are saying is actually correct. So we went through Canadian Green Building Council standard and got those certifications. Mount Dennis was the first one in Toronto to get that certification. Northeast Scarborough will be the first community center with the indoor pool. We believe it's the first one in Canada, but that needs to be confirmed. We have over 15 other buildings that are in design, and a couple of them mentioned here, and will be shown in the next slides. I just want to highlight Davisville Aquatic Center building, because this building actually, some of our buildings, because of the, it's typically low rise, and if they have they're big and they don't have they're not shaded, they can actually get to net zero energy as well and kind of offset everything, their carbon emissions by producing renewable energy on site. This one cannot do that. This one is midtown, it's fully shaded. There is absolutely no way that we should put any solar there. Just it'll be completely shaded by the buildings to the south and west, and it wouldn't make any sense. So they, instead of putting solar, they put a active roof in design and agree. So they use the roof for programming, for activities, for community. There'll be community gardens there as well. So different use of roof space as well. But on the next slide, you can see it's indoor pool. It's for aquatics focused facility. And when you look at on the pie chart on the TEDI one on the left side, is you can see that reheat is a huge part of the TEDI requirements are because of that. So they really struggle with that, and it's a very tight site. So they did achieve near net zero. We would have to either have offsite renewables or purchase carbon credits at the end of the construction or at the end of 2040. But we felt that because of their unique situation, they've really focused on electrifying the building and reducing TEDI as much as possible by utilizing as much passive design strategies, building very compact, paying very close attention to massing, orientation, glazing, air tightness testing. It was all thermal bridging. They were really focusing on that. As TEDI was passive side was going through the design as well, that in fact it reduced the energy loads on the TUI. They used energy recovery systems, mechanical system were used. They're using the geo system and combined with the air source heat pump, because because of the tight location, they were not able to 100% provide heating, so they had to air source heat pump. In any case, it's very efficient building, and it's electrified building. It's ready for net zero, and the only emissions that are associated there are coming from the grid use. So hopefully, as our grid over the next decade gets cleaner, this building will actually become net zero. And if not, then we will deal with that. We have to deal with that with the carbon offsets. So the next slide, just want to shift a little bit here. We did a couple of embodied carbon studies already on the buildings. This particular building is going to be a net zero building. They also did the embodied carbon study fairly late, because this is a slightly earlier design, so it was going through version 3 of TGS before the embodied carbon target was requirement was introduced. So we still went through the embodied carbon study to see where we are. That building already had, because they were trying to make it as more sustainable, already had fairly low baseline for the upfront carbon. But through the study, they identified a few other reduction strategies, and the top 3 ones that have the most effect are the ones that they also committed to refine that they designed. It was already in detailed design stage, but they were able to refine it by specifying lower carbon concrete. They were specifying lower impact insulation and the concrete sealant. Those 3 changes brought over 800 tons of CO2 that were avoided in use in the manufacturing for this building. And just last slide for me is just the summer recommendations. There may be more. I think they should be applicable to residential buildings as well, and mid-rise at least, if not high-rise one. But massing is the first step as we see it. If you can go to window to wall ratio down to 30%, that's great. If you can be thermal broken balconies, If you have to use balconies in the first place, if you don't have to, that's great. That's even better. But if you have to use balconies or you want to use balconies, the thermal broken balconies it's the best solution that we can have. So focusing on passive measures first, minimizing parking as much as you can, especially underground parking, because that is where majority of embodied carbon comes from. Is actually the low grade use of in some cases like 2/3 of embodied carbon comes from a few floors of underground facility versus 20-30 floors above ground. If you can use geo-exchange systems, because of the efficiency and lower energy use, and also you get some mechanical penthouse space that you can be using for active roof, like we see in Davisville, or for the solar PV as well. And on materials, again, specify low carbon concrete, avoid high embodied carbon insulation and aluminum, for example. So that's all for me for now. If you have any questions, be free if you have time. If not, I'll give it out to somebody else next.
Thank you so much.